Hello. If you want to understand why China's dominating world trade, you need to look at what's been happening to the global steel industry. It's quite extraordinary. In a few short years, China has come to dominate this sector, and that means it's going to dominate every industry in which steel is essential, like ships and cars and tanks and many, many other things for years to come. This is how it happened. I'm Jasper Becker, and I've been reporting on China since 1985, and China continues to astonish me. Let me show you the first graph. As you can see, it shows the dramatic increase in steel production that took place over just a few years. In 15 years, China's steelmaking capacity went up 6 times. It started making 1 billion tons of steel. That is incredible. That is more than the other top 10 producers put together. India produces about 150 million tons. Japan produces 84 million tons. The United States slightly less. When I first went to China in the 1980s, China's steel industry was a hopeless mess, like the rest of the state-owned enterprise sector. Hugely overstaffed, massive pension liabilities, outdated equipment, poor transport links, and drowning in debt. It looked like an irredeemable basket case. Now it virtually controls the global industry. It sets the price for iron ore and for steel exports. Here's a graph showing how closely Chinese steel production matches global iron ore prices, and another graph showing how the big increase in Chinese steel output from 2005 to 2020 determined international prices for hot rolled coil. China effectively controls who can make profits and who will go to the wall. That's real power. Chairman Mao would be proud. His burning ambition in the 1950s was to overtake the United Kingdom's steel production. These days, the UK barely makes any steel at all. It just recycles old steel scraps. Here's a graph showing the rise of Chinese steel exports. This might hit over 120 million tons this year. China is flooding the world with cheap steel. It has effectively shut out other major steel exporters like Japan, South Korea, the EU, from global markets. In fact, steel mills in the US and the EU only survived thanks to protectionism. They shut the door to Chinese steel exports. How did this happen? And how did it happen so quickly? It's basically thanks to cheap loans and all kinds of subsidies. An OECD audit a few years ago found that Chinese steelmakers receive 10 times more support than producers in OECD countries. That's the Club of Developed Countries. But this excludes low market loans, debt swaps, or cheap energy, which are much harder to track, and VAT rebates on exports, often 13%, which made shipping steel abroad incredibly profitable. China has cut this rebate, but this only briefly stopped exports. They soon resumed climbing. It's quite possible that China has invested something like $1 trillion in the industry over the last 20 years, although this is just an estimate. But has this been profitable? The answer is both yes and no. On the one hand, the major companies like Baogang or Angang don't seem to be very profitable at all, judging by the rise and fall of their share price. Look at this graph. Anyone who bought shares in Baogang or Angang back in 2007 has lost big time. Baogang is down more than 60% in dollar terms. Anshan over Angang over 80%. And that's before you take into account factors like inflation and exchange rates. Some reports I've seen say that only 5% of steelmakers in China are making a profit in 2025. The flood of cheap Chinese steel has also made steelmaking everywhere and anywhere quite unprofitable. Global giants like ArcelorMittal and ThyssenKrupp have seen the value of their shares collapse by 2/3. In 2023 alone, US steel companies lost $1.2 billion. Japanese and South Korean steelmakers also barely make a profit. So, has this vast investment in Chinese steelmaking actually created jobs in China? The answer is not what you'd expect. The answer is not what you would expect. Look at this graph. It actually shows a collapse in employment. The official number of steelworkers in China fell from over 4 million in 2013 to just 1.7 million by 2025. Some of this is due to closures and mergers and rationalization. A lot of it is because of innovation and automation. The industry is just not that labor intensive anymore. But although jobs have been lost in the steel industry, as we'll discuss later, jobs have been created in other industries. It's also true that the investment in the steel sector hasn't raised wages either. Chinese wages are still much lower, around $10,000 to $15,000 a year, compared to $40,000 to $60,000 in Europe or the US. So China's steel industry has benefited from all kinds of government support and China's famously low labor costs. But its real competitive advantage is cheap energy. Most Chinese mills run on domestic coal, which is heavily subsidized and much cheaper than imported fuel. Electricity prices range from 5 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour, compared to 15 to 20 cents in the West. That alone can help cut production costs by $20 to $50 per ton. Look at the difference in production costs in this graph. It is just about 30% cheaper to make steel in China than anywhere else. And add to that are the massive economies of scale you get when you're making 1 billion tons of steel, and a logistics network that's now second to none. China can now import huge quantities of iron ore and ship finished steel faster and cheaper than anyone else, often using its own ships. Its mills also operate at about 80% capacity, compared to 70% in Europe or America, and many are now among the most energy efficient in the world. That said, things have become more difficult since the domestic property market has crashed. This was China's biggest customer for steel, and demand is down by at least 10%, and that's not likely to come back anytime soon. So there's quite a lot of overcapacity in the steel industry. Meanwhile, the US and Europe have slammed the door with tariffs and quotas. The US now imposes a 25% tariff and anti-dumping duties. The EU does the same, and from 2026, its carbon border adjustment mechanism will add a carbon tax on coal-based steel. So we now see China pushing exports into Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Here's a graph showing the dramatic increase in Chinese steel exports, and another showing Chinese steel exports by destination. Countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand now take nearly 30% of its exports. In Latin America, shipments have more than tripled over 15 years. The result is very bad for local mills. They can't compete. Many have closed or slashed production. Even British Steel, which is now Chinese-owned, has cut nearly 3,000 jobs, and plants in Port Talbot and Scunthorpe are switching to recycling instead of making new steel. In India, imports from China hit record highs last year, turning India into a net importer. So across Asia, Europe, and the America, tens of thousands of steel workers have lost their jobs. The industry has shed over 100,000 jobs in the last 20 years. But earlier on, I was talking about the fact that although the Chinese steel industry may not be showing a good return on the money plowed into it, that is not the full story. China's cheap energy, which means cheap steel, means that it is cheaper to build houses, railways, bridges, ports, and other infrastructure. It also helps China export many, many other things, like ships, cars, cranes, tanks, tractors, you name it, at very, very low prices. So China is now the world's biggest exporter by a country mile, exporting 15% of global exports. Its trade surplus in 2024 is reckoned to have topped $1 trillion US, and of this, 90% of its exports are manufactured goods, not services. And that picture is not going to change anytime soon.